Douglas Lewis thought he was about to solve the mystery of a $10 tip. Instead, he uncovered a promise so heartbreaking it had quietly controlled a billionaire's life for years. By the time she finished telling him the truth, neither of them would ever walk into Cedar Grove Diner the same way again. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I've got another unforgettable story coming your way soon. Before we jump back in, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's listening from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. The bell above Cedar Grove Diner rang at 7 a.m., same as it had every morning for the last 11 months. Douglas Lewis didn't need to look up. He already knew who it was. She walked the same path every time, past the counter, past the register, straight to booth 7 by the window. Cream blazer, no rings, no phone in her hand, which struck Douglas as strange the first week, and now just felt like part of who she was. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and waited for the coffee she hadn't even ordered yet, because she never had to. "Morning, Miss Adair," Douglas said, setting the cup down. "Morning, Douglas." She said his name the way most people said their own. Easy, familiar, like it belonged to her too. "How's your girl doing? Still beating me at checkers? I think she's letting me lose on purpose now, which is somehow worse." Lucy almost smiled. Almost. She had a way of holding back the last 10% of every expression, like she'd learned a long time ago not to give more of herself than a room deserved. He took her order: black coffee, wheat toast, fresh fruit, the same 3 things she'd ordered every single day since the first morning she walked in, and left her to the quiet. That was the thing about Lucy Adair. She never asked for anything. Never complained if the toast came out a shade too dark. Never raised her voice. Never rushed him. Never once made him feel like the 11 other tables mattered less than hers. And every morning, before she left, she did the same thing. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a single $10 bill, folded once down the middle, and set it beside her plate. Not 8, not 15, not a 20 she waved off with a keep the change. $10, exactly, every day. Douglas had stopped mentioning it out loud months ago, back when Denny, the line cook, used to lean over the pass-through window and whisper things like, "That woman's either superstitious or that bill's got a story attached to it, and either way, it ain't my business, but it sure is interesting." Douglas had laughed it off then. He wasn't laughing it off anymore. Not really. Somewhere around month 4, the question had planted itself somewhere behind his ribs, and just stayed there, quiet, patient, growing a little heavier every time that bill hit the table. Why $10? Not because the amount was small. $10 on a $7 breakfast was a fine tip by anyone's math. But Lucy Adair could leave 100 without blinking. He'd seen the way she carried herself, the quiet weight of money that didn't need to announce itself. A woman like that didn't need to think twice about a tip. And yet every single morning, she did the same math, folded the same bill, and left it in the same spot on the table. Today, for reasons he couldn't quite explain even to himself, Douglas almost asked. He'd walked halfway back to her booth, with the coffee pot still in his hand, the question sitting right there on his tongue. Why 10? Why always 10? When the door chimed behind him and a party of 4 walked in asking for a table near the window, and just like that, the moment slipped through his fingers again. By the time he turned back around, Lucy was already gathering her coat. "Have a good one, Douglas," she said, and left the way she always did. Quiet, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world, even though everyone who worked at Cedar Grove knew she didn't. She was somewhere important by 7:45 every single day. Nobody quite knew where. Nobody asked. Douglas cleared her plate, picked up the folded bill. He didn't know why he stopped to look at it this time, but he did. Turned it over once in his fingers, like it might tell him something the woman herself never had. Just a bill, Lincoln's face a little worn at the corners. Nothing special about it at all, except that it was never, ever, anything but exactly this. "You gonna frame that thing or put it in the register?" Denny called out from the kitchen, grinning. "Just thinking," Douglas said. "About what?" Douglas slid the bill into his apron pocket and picked up the coffee pot again. About how long a man can wonder about something before he finally just asks. Behind him, his daughter's voice echoed in his head, unprompted, the way kids' questions do at the strangest times. She'd asked him once, walking home from school, if he thought the breakfast lady was lonely. He'd laughed it off that day too. Told her Miss Adair was just a busy woman who liked her mornings quiet. But lately he wasn't so sure that was the whole truth. Lately he was starting to think there was a reason underneath the reason, the way there usually is with people who keep the same exact routine for almost a year straight, without ever once explaining why. He glanced toward the window. Booth 7 sat empty now, sunlight falling across the table where she'd been sitting minutes before. $10. Every morning. Never once different. Douglas didn't know yet that the answer waiting behind that number had nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with a version of Lucy Adair he hadn't met yet, one who'd been 19, terrified, and running out of gas long before she ever became the woman who walked through that door every morning like clockwork. He just knew, standing there with the coffee pot going cold in his hand, that one of these mornings he was finally going to ask. And whatever she told him, he had a feeling it was going to change more than just his understanding of a $10 bill. Weeks passed the way they always did at Cedar Grove, fast in the moment, slow in memory. But something had shifted since that morning Douglas almost asked. He couldn't put his finger on what, exactly. Just that the 11 minutes between Lucy sitting down and Lucy leaving had started to feel less like part of his shift and more like something he looked forward to. He had her coffee poured before she reached the booth now. Didn't even think about it anymore. Black, no sugar, in the cup with the small chip on the handle that she never mentioned and he never replaced, because some habits just settled into a rhythm nobody wanted to disturb. "You remembered the toast order changed," she said one Tuesday, looking almost surprised. "You asked for it a shade lighter last week. Figured that wasn't a one-time thing." She studied him for a second too long. Most people don't pay attention like that. Most people aren't paying attention to the right things, Douglas said, and went back to the counter before it could turn into more than it was. It wasn't flirting, he told himself that more than once. It was just decency, the kind of decency he tried to hand out to every person who walked through that door, whether they tipped $10 or none at all. He'd learned that lesson from his own father, long before the diner, long before his daughter, long before life had asked him to carry more than he expected to at 34. Lucy noticed things too. She noticed when he looked tired, the mornings after his daughter had a bad dream, and climbed into his bed at 2 a.m., and neither of them slept right after that. She noticed when Douglas quietly comped a plate for Mr. Ellery, the old man 3 booths down who came in every few days and counted his coins twice before ordering, like the second count might change the number. She noticed when Douglas slid a Togo box across the counter to a young veteran who'd been sitting outside the diner for 2 days, not asking anyone for anything, just existing in the cold, and how Douglas never once made it a moment, never called attention to it, just handed it over like the man was any other customer who mattered. She never said anything about it directly, but she started leaving a little more for the other waiters after that. Not for Douglas. His $10 stayed exactly the same, untouched by whatever she was noticing, but for everyone else at Cedar Grove, like she was quietly rewarding a kindness she saw radiating out from one man into an entire diner. Douglas caught that too, eventually, filed it away without asking about it, same as everything else about Lucy Adair that didn't add up cleanly. One Saturday, walking home from the park, his daughter tugged his sleeve and asked the kind of question only an 8-year-old can ask without any warning. "Dad, do you think the breakfast lady's lonely?" Douglas nearly tripped over the crack in the sidewalk. "Where's that coming from? She's always by herself. Every time you talk about her, it's just her and the coffee. No friends, no husband, nobody waiting for her." "She's a busy woman," Douglas said, the same answer he always gave, though this time it came out a little slower, like the words needed more convincing behind them than usual. Busy people like quiet mornings. His daughter didn't look convinced, but she let it go, the way kids do when they've planted something in a parent's head and don't even realize they've done it. Douglas thought about it the rest of that weekend. Lucy Adair, quiet and unhurried, and never once mentioning a name outside of his and his daughter's. No mention of family, no mention of anyone waiting for her at the end of a long day. Just booth 7, coffee, and a $10 bill that meant something he still didn't understand. Monday morning, she said something that stuck with him longer than most things did. "Places like this matter more than people think," she told him, stirring her coffee slowly. "Some places just make you feel safe the moment you walk in. Most people never notice why. They just know they keep coming back." Douglas laughed a little. "You say that like Cedar Grove's some kind of miracle. It's toast and eggs, Miss Adair." "It's not the toast," she said, and there was something underneath her voice that Douglas couldn't quite name. "It's never the toast." She didn't explain further. She rarely did. And Douglas, same as always, let it sit instead of chasing it down, because chasing things down wasn't his way. And besides, there'd be tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, stretching out ahead of them, steady as the sunrise. Except the next morning, booth 7 stayed empty. Douglas noticed at 7:05. Told himself she was running late. At 7:15, he told himself the same thing again, a little less convinced. By 7:30, he'd checked the door so many times that Denny leaned through the pass window and asked if he was expecting somebody important. "Just a regular," Douglas said, which wasn't a lie, but wasn't the whole truth either. By 8 o'clock, the breakfast rush had filled every other booth in the diner. Laughter and clatter, and the ordinary noise of a Tuesday morning, and booth 7 sat there untouched, sunlight falling across an empty table where a folded $10 bill should have been. Douglas told himself it didn't mean anything. People had emergencies. People had lives outside a diner booth, lives he knew almost nothing about despite 11 months of mornings together. But standing there, refilling cups he wasn't really paying attention to, Douglas realized something that unsettled him more than he expected. He didn't just miss the routine. He missed her. And he had no idea yet what that was going to cost him, or what it was going to mean the moment he found out exactly who Lucy Adair really was. By 9 o'clock, Douglas had convinced himself he was being ridiculous. He'd been keeping tables clean, refilling cups, laughing at the right moments when regulars cracked their usual jokes. But every time the bell above the door rang, his eyes flicked toward it before he could stop them. 9 times out of 10, it was somebody he half recognized. Never Lucy. Never the cream blazer. Never the quiet steps toward booth 7. "You keep looking at that door like it owes you money," Denny said, sliding a plate of hash browns onto the pass window. "I'm working," Douglas said. "You're working and looking." "Two different things, my man." Denny wiped his hands on his apron, grinning the way he always did when he'd found something to needle Douglas about for the rest of the shift. "It's the coffee lady, isn't it? Booth 7's been empty all morning, and you've refilled that same sugar dispenser 4 times. "I have not." "You have. I counted." Douglas didn't answer that, mostly because he didn't have a good one. He busied himself wiping down the counter instead, telling himself it was just decency, just noticing a regular hadn't come in, nothing more than that. But somewhere, underneath the noise of the diner, underneath the clatter of plates and the low hum of morning conversation, there was a small, quiet worry he couldn't quite talk himself out of. He told himself she probably just had a meeting, a busy woman like her. Of course she had somewhere else to be some mornings. It didn't mean anything. Still, he kept glancing at the door. By 11, the breakfast rush had thinned into the slow stretch before lunch, and Douglas was restocking napkin dispensers when the bell rang one more time. He didn't look up right away this time, told himself he wasn't going to keep doing that to himself, but something made him glance over anyway. Lucy stood just inside the door, coat still buttoned, looking a little more rushed than he'd ever seen her. "I'm sorry," she said, walking straight toward him instead of booth 7. "I know it's late. Something came up early this morning and I couldn't get away." "You don't owe me an explanation, Ms. Adair," Douglas said, and meant it, though the words came out lighter than the relief sitting underneath his ribs. "I know, I just—" She stopped herself, like she'd caught something in her own voice she hadn't meant to let show. "I didn't want you to think I just stopped showing up. I didn't think that. You checked the door 4 times according to your cook. Douglas shot a look toward the kitchen, where Denny was very deliberately pretending to be busy with a spatula. He exaggerates. He seemed pretty confident about the number. For a second, neither of them said anything, and Douglas realized, uncomfortably, that the relief he felt at her walking through that door wasn't the kind of relief you feel over a regular customer showing up late. It sat heavier than that, warmer than that. He didn't have a name for it yet, and he wasn't in any hurry to go looking for one. Lucy noticed. She always noticed. But she let it pass, same as she let most things pass, and slid into booth 7 like the morning was starting over from scratch. "Business emergency," she said when he brought her coffee. "Nothing worth boring you with. Try me." She almost smiled at that, the real kind, not the held-back version she usually gave him. Maybe another time. Over the following weeks, their conversations stretched longer than they used to. She started asking about the restaurant Douglas dreamed of opening someday, the one he talked about like it was a promise instead of a plan. He told her about the corner lot 2 blocks from his apartment, empty for 3 years, how he sometimes walked past it just to imagine what it could look like with his name over the door. "You'd do menus or comfort food, family style?" she asked. "Family style, something that feels like Sunday dinner even on a Tuesday." "That's a good dream," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made Douglas think she meant more by it than the words themselves carried. In return, she told him she traveled often, though never why, and Douglas learned not to press. There were parts of Lucy Adair that stayed folded shut, same as that $10 bill she left every morning, and he'd come to accept that some mornings you only got to see the parts she was ready to show. One evening, his daughter came home from school with a drawing clutched proudly in her hand. She spread it across the kitchen table before Douglas had even taken his shoes off. "That's you," she said, pointing to a figure with a black apron. "That's me. And that's the breakfast lady." Douglas looked at the third figure. Blonde hair, a coffee cup drawn twice the size it should have been, standing right between the two of them like she belonged there. "She's part of the picture now?" he asked. His daughter shrugged like it was obvious. "She's part of the mornings. I figured she should be part of the picture too." Douglas didn't have an answer for that. He just taped the drawing to the fridge and told himself it didn't mean what it looked like it meant. The following Thursday, leaving Cedar Grove after a long shift, Douglas nearly walked straight into a line of black SUVs pulled up along the curb outside the office tower 2 blocks down. Men in suits moved fast, phones pressed to their ears. A small crowd of executives clustered near the entrance, like they were waiting on someone important. Douglas slowed his steps, more out of curiosity than anything else, and that was when he saw her. Lucy stepped out of the second SUV, security falling into step on either side of her, executives rushing forward the second her shoes hit the pavement. Douglas stood frozen on the sidewalk, coffee-stained apron still tied around his waist, watching a woman he thought he knew disappear into a version of herself he'd never once seen at booth 7. Douglas didn't sleep much that night. He kept replaying it, the SUVs, the security fanning out around her like she was something valuable that needed protecting, the executives practically tripping over themselves to reach her first. That wasn't the Lucy who asked about his daughter's school recital. That wasn't the woman who left exactly $10 folded under a coffee cup like the number meant something only she understood. He got home, kissed his daughter goodnight, and sat at the kitchen table long after she'd fallen asleep, phone in his hand, typing her name into a search bar he'd never once thought to use in 11 months of mornings. Lucy Adair. The first result was a magazine cover. The second was a business journal headline calling her one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. The third was a photograph of her shaking hands with a senator, dressed exactly the way she'd looked stepping out of that SUV. Poised, composed, worlds away from booth 7. Douglas set the phone down like it had gotten too hot to hold. He read more anyway. Founder of 2 technology companies before she turned 30. A foundation with her name on it, quietly funding shelters and scholarship programs in cities she'd apparently never publicly visited. Reporters described her as private, guarded, almost impossible to get a personal quote from. One article called her the billionaire nobody really knows. Except Douglas knew things about her nobody else seemed to. He knew she liked her toast a shade lighter now. He knew she hated small talk about the weather, but would talk for 10 minutes about a book she was reading. He knew the exact way she held her coffee cup with both hands, like she was warming them even when it wasn't cold. He also knew, sitting there at his kitchen table at 11 at night, that maybe none of that had meant what he thought it meant. Maybe she was just being polite to the help. Maybe the whole friendly, familiar thing was just good manners from someone who could afford to be gracious to everyone beneath her. The thought sat in his chest like a stone the rest of the night. The next morning, he almost didn't want her to walk in. But at 7 o'clock sharp, the bell rang, and there she was. Same cream blazer, same unhurried steps toward booth 7, same quiet as always. No entourage, no security, no sign at all of the woman who'd stepped out of that SUV 2 nights before. Douglas brought her coffee without quite meeting her eyes. "Something wrong?" Lucy asked, the second he set the cup down. "Nothing's wrong." "Douglas," she said his name, the way she always did, but there was an edge of patience under it now, like she already suspected the answer. "Did something change?" He hesitated a moment too long. "I learned something about you." Lucy went still, just for a second. Then she looked down at her coffee, and when she looked back up, there was something almost tired behind her eyes. "I suppose someone finally recognized me." "You could have told me," Douglas said, quieter than he meant to. "Told you what? That I own 2 companies you'd never heard of before last night? That people rearrange their entire schedules around 15 minutes of my time?" She shook her head slowly. "That's not who I am at 7 in the morning, Douglas. That's who I have to be everywhere else. So why here?" Lucy looked around the diner, at the chipped counter, the regulars hunched over their own coffee, the smell of bacon grease that never quite left the air, no matter how many times the place got cleaned. "Because nobody here has ever once treated me like I was worth more because of a number in a bank account. Especially not you." Douglas felt something in his chest loosen, just slightly. "I didn't know I was doing anything special." "That's exactly why it worked," she said. He pulled a rag from his apron, more out of habit than need, wiping at a spot on the counter that was already clean. "I'm sorry, for last night, standing there staring at you like you were a stranger." "Don't apologize for that," Lucy said, and something in her voice had softened all the way now. "That's exactly why I keep coming back here. Because for 15 minutes every morning, I get to just be a woman drinking coffee, and nobody's rushing me toward the next decision that's going to affect 4,000 employees." Douglas studied her for a long moment. "That sounds lonely." "It is," she said simply. "No self-pity in it, just fact. But it's less lonely here." He wanted to ask her then, the question that had been sitting behind his ribs for almost a year, the one about the $10, the one that felt suddenly more urgent now that he understood just how deliberately she'd chosen this diner, this booth, this exact routine, out of every possible place in the city she could have gone instead. He opened his mouth. "Douglas, can we get some service over here?" A voice called from 2 booths down, one of the regulars waving a menu like it was on fire. The moment slipped away again, same as it always seemed to right when he got close. Lucy watched him go, something unreadable behind her expression, and by the time Douglas made it back to booth 7 15 minutes later, she was already gone, coffee cup empty, plate cleared, and a folded $10 bill sitting exactly where it always sat, untouched by anything that had just passed between them. Douglas picked it up slowly this time, turning it over in his fingers the way he had that first morning weeks ago. Whatever this bill meant to her, he was starting to understand it went far deeper than money. He just didn't know yet how far back the story really went, or how close he was about to get to finding out. The weeks that followed felt different, though Douglas couldn't have said exactly when the shift happened. Lucy still arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, still ordered the same 3 things, still left the same folded bill beside her plate. But something between them had loosened since the morning he admitted he'd looked her up. She talked more freely now, laughed a little easier, stopped holding back that last 10% of herself, the way she used to. She started asking real questions about the restaurant he wanted to open. Not polite conversation questions, but the kind that meant she'd actually been thinking about it between visits. What would he call it? Would he keep the same chipped coffee mugs from Cedar Grove, just for the memory of it? whether his daughter would want her name on the menu somewhere, the way some family places did. "You've thought about this longer than I have," Douglas told her one morning, only half joking. "Somebody has to believe in it while you're too busy working double shifts to believe in it yourself," she said, and went back to her toast, like she hadn't just said something that sat with him the rest of the day. In return, Douglas found himself pushing back gently whenever she mentioned another red-eye flight, another weekend spent in a boardroom instead of resting. "You ever just take a Saturday?" he asked her once. "Just one, no calls." "I don't remember the last time I did that." That's not an answer. She'd almost smiled at that, the real kind. No, it's not. Their daughters, or rather, his daughter, became part of it too, without anyone planning it that way. One afternoon, Douglas picked her up early from school for a dentist appointment and ran into Lucy on the sidewalk outside, coffee in hand, clearly between meetings. His daughter, without an ounce of hesitation, asked if the breakfast lady wanted to get ice cream with them. Douglas expected Lucy to make an excuse. She didn't. She bought 2 cones and a coffee for herself, sat on the curb with an 8-year-old for 20 minutes, and didn't check her phone once. Walking home afterward, Douglas noticed something he hadn't let himself notice before. How easy it had all felt. How natural. Like the 3 of them had been doing this for years instead of 20 minutes. He started paying closer attention after that. Not just to what Lucy said, but to the small things she did without seeming to realize he'd catch them. The way she paused, just for a second, every single morning, looking down at the folded $10 bill in her hand before setting it on the table, like she was remembering something, or someone, before she let it go. It wasn't a long pause. Most people would have missed it entirely. But Douglas had watched her do it enough mornings now to know it wasn't habit. It was ritual, and rituals, he'd come to understand, always meant something underneath. He thought about asking a dozen different times, once with a full diner around them, the words right there on his tongue, before a table of 6 waved him down for refills. Once on a quiet Sunday morning when he almost had the nerve, before Denny came crashing through the kitchen doors with a story about a delivery mix-up that swallowed the moment whole. Every time something got in the way. Every time Douglas told himself there'd be another morning. Then one Tuesday, the sky opened up before sunrise, and the rain kept most of the regulars home. Cedar Grove sat nearly empty by 7 o'clock. Just Lucy, in booth 7, an elderly couple by the window, and Douglas, with nowhere else he needed to be, for the first time in almost a year of mornings. He brought her coffee, then lingered, instead of walking away. Lucy noticed immediately. She always did. "You're not leaving." "Not this time." She set her cup down slowly, like she already understood what was coming. Douglas picked up the folded bill sitting beside her plate, carefully, like it might not survive being handled wrong, and looked at her the way he'd wanted to for months. "Can I ask you something I've been wondering about for almost a year?" Lucy's expression softened into something quieter than he'd seen from her before. "You finally decided to ask. Why is it always exactly $10? The question hung there in the empty diner, rain tapping steady against the windows, the elderly couple's quiet conversation the only other sound in the room. Lucy looked down at the bill in Douglas's hand. Whatever she'd been holding back for 11 months, Douglas watched it rise slowly to the surface of her face, the smile fading first, then something heavier settling in behind her eyes, memories she clearly hadn't let herself sit with in a long time. Several seconds passed before she spoke again. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "Come in a little early." Douglas frowned. "Why not now?" "Because this isn't a 5-minute answer, Douglas." Her voice had dropped, softer than he'd ever heard it. "This is the reason for everything. And you deserve to hear all of it, not just the parts that fit between customers." She stood before he could respond, gathering her coat with hands that weren't quite as steady as usual. For the first time in 11 months, Lucy Adair left Cedar Grove Diner without finishing her coffee. Douglas stood there holding the folded bill, watching her walk out into the rain, and stared down at the untouched cup she'd left behind, steam still rising off the surface, going cold in the empty booth. Whatever she was about to tell him, he had the feeling tomorrow morning was going to change everything he thought he understood about the woman in booth 7. Douglas got to Cedar Grove before sunrise, letting himself in with the spare key he'd carried for 3 years and rarely used before opening hours. The diner sat dark and quiet, chairs still upturned on tables from the night before, the smell of yesterday's coffee still lingering faint in the air. Lucy was already there. She sat in booth 7, no coat, no blazer this time, just a simple sweater, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. She looked smaller somehow, without the armor of her usual composure, like she'd stripped something away on purpose before walking through that door. Douglas set down his own cup and sat across from her without a word. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rain from the night before still clung to the windows in slow streaks, and the diner held that particular stillness that only exists in the minutes before a place wakes up. "Thank you for coming early," Lucy said finally. "You said you'd tell me everything." She nodded, staring down at her coffee like the answer might be floating somewhere in it. "I need you to understand something first. This isn't a story I've told anyone. Not my board, not the reporters who've tried for years to dig up where I came from. Nobody. You don't have to. I want to," she said, cutting him off gently. "I think I've wanted to for a long time. I just never had anyone worth telling." Douglas stayed quiet after that, and Lucy began. She wasn't always Lucy Adair, founder, CEO, the woman on magazine covers. Once, she was 19 years old, sitting in a car with a cracked windshield, running from a house she never wanted to think about again. She didn't go into details about what she was running from, just that it wasn't safe, and that she'd left with almost nothing, driving without any real plan except away. "I had maybe $4 in change," she said. "Enough for 1 cup of coffee if I was careful. I hadn't eaten in almost 2 days." She'd pulled into a roadside diner off some highway she couldn't even name anymore. One of those places that existed in the space between towns. The kind nobody remembers unless something happens there. She sat at the counter, ordered coffee because it was all she could afford, and tried not to let anyone see that she'd been crying most of the drive. An old waiter noticed anyway. "He didn't ask me anything," Lucy said. "Didn't ask where I was going or what I was running from, or why a girl my age was sitting alone at 2 in the morning with nothing but change in her pocket. He just brought the coffee, and a few minutes later, when I got up to leave, he took my hand." Douglas watched her carefully, saying nothing. "He folded a $10 bill into my palm," she continued, her voice thinner now. "I tried to give it back, told him I couldn't take it. He just closed my fingers around it and said, 'Don't mistake this for charity. Someday you'll be the one helping someone else.'" She stopped there, blinking hard, and Douglas realized her hands had started trembling slightly around the cup. "That $10 bought me enough gas to make it 60 miles down the road, to a women's shelter I didn't even know existed until another stranger mentioned it to me at a gas station. That shelter gave me a bed. Then it gave me a GED program, then a mentor who helped me apply for a small business grant I never thought I'd qualify for." She let out a breath that shook on the way out. "Everything after that, every company, every headline, every board meeting, all of it traces back to one folded bill from a man whose name I never even got." Douglas felt something tighten in his own chest, a lump he hadn't expected. "You never saw him again." "Never. I went back years later, once I had the money to actually help, and the diner was gone, torn down. Nobody in town even remembered it." She wiped at her eyes quickly, like she was embarrassed by the tears, even though there was no one there to judge her but Douglas. "So every morning, since the day I could afford to, I've gone to a different diner and left exactly $10. Not because the amount means anything to whoever gets it, but because it means everything to me." "It's not about generosity," Douglas said slowly, understanding settling into him piece by piece. "It's about keeping a promise," Lucy said. "A promise I made to a stranger who probably never thought about me again after that night. I don't know if he's even still alive. But every time I fold that bill, it's like I'm telling him I kept my word. I did become someone who helps." Douglas reached across the table without thinking and covered her hand with his. "That waiter," he said quietly. "He had no idea he was saving a billionaire." Lucy shook her head, and for the first time since he'd known her, she let the tears fall without trying to stop them. He didn't save a billionaire, Douglas. He saved a terrified girl who didn't think she had anything left worth saving. The billionaire part came later. That part was never the point. The diner sat silent around them, empty booths and cold coffee, and the gray light of morning just beginning to touch the windows. "The reason I kept coming here," Lucy said after a while, her voice barely above a whisper, "wasn't just to honor him." Douglas looked at her, waiting. She opened her mouth like she meant to finish the thought, and then, just as quickly, she pulled her hand back, wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, and stood. "I have to go," she said. "I'll explain the rest tomorrow." Douglas sat there long after she'd gone, staring at the empty booth, the untouched coffee, and the folded bill she'd left behind, out of habit, even on a morning that had nothing to do with breakfast at all. You just watched what $10 and one stranger's kindness can rebuild. If that moved you even a little, don't let this be the last time you see something like it. Subscribing costs you nothing, but scrolling away costs someone else the chance to find this story when they need it most. Douglas spent the whole day distracted. He burned a batch of hash browns he never burned, gave a table the wrong check twice. Denny finally pulled him aside near the walk-in cooler and asked, only half joking, if he needed to sit down for a minute. "I'm fine," Douglas said. "You're somewhere else today. Whatever she told you this morning, it's still sitting on you." Douglas didn't argue with that. He couldn't have if he tried. Lucy's voice kept replaying in his head. "The reason I kept coming here wasn't just to honor him." The sentence she'd started and never finished, hanging there unresolved the rest of the day like a held breath. He barely slept that night either, running through every possible ending to that sentence, none of them feeling like enough to explain the way she'd looked right before she stopped herself. The next morning she came in at 7, same as always, but there was something steadier in her eyes than there'd been the day before, like she'd spent the night making peace with finishing what she'd started. She didn't wait for him to ask. "I said something yesterday I didn't finish," Lucy said, once he'd brought her coffee and sat down across from her, the diner still quiet enough around them for the conversation to feel private. "I think I owe you the rest of it." Douglas nodded, waiting. "The first morning I ever walked into Cedar Grove, I wasn't planning on coming back," she said. "I was scouting locations for a foundation partnership a few blocks from here, and I stopped in because I needed coffee and didn't want to be recognized anywhere fancier." She turned her cup slowly on the table. "I was sitting exactly where I sit now, and I watched an elderly man 3 booths down count his change twice before he ordered, like he was hoping the number might be different the second time." Douglas knew immediately who she meant. "Mr. Ellery. I didn't know his name yet. I just watched you walk over, take his order, and quietly tell him breakfast was on the house that morning. No announcement, no look toward the register to make sure anyone saw what a good person you were being. You just did it and moved on to the next table like it was nothing." Douglas felt his face warm slightly. "That's not—" "Let me finish," Lucy said gently. "Because it wasn't nothing, not to me. It was exactly what that old waiter did for me all those years ago. Same quiet way. No audience, no expectation of anything in return." Her eyes held his, steady now. "I sat in that booth and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Like maybe the world still had people like him in it. Like maybe it wasn't just something that happened to me once, a long time ago, and never again." Douglas sat with that for a moment, the weight of it settling somewhere he hadn't expected. "So you didn't choose this diner," he said slowly. "You chose me." "I chose you," Lucy admitted. "I told myself I'd come back once, just to see if it was really what I thought it was, or if I'd imagined it. And then once became twice, and twice became every morning. And somewhere along the way, it stopped being about him entirely, and started being about you." Douglas didn't know what to say to that. He'd spent almost a year wondering about a $10 bill, never once considering that the real mystery had been himself the whole time. "I never knew anyone notice things like that," he said finally. "People notice more than you think. You just never expect anyone to say it out loud." Something in the conversation had shifted after that, not dramatically, not with any big declaration, but quietly, the way most real things shift. Lucy started asking him questions she'd never asked before. About his late wife, how he'd managed to keep going after losing her, how he found the strength to raise his daughter alone without letting the weight of it show on his face every day. Douglas answered honestly, more honestly than he'd talked about it with almost anyone. He told her about the year after his wife passed, how some mornings getting out of bed felt impossible, how his daughter's laugh was the only thing that reminded him some days were still worth getting through. In return, Lucy told him things she'd never said to her board, her investors, or anyone in the life she lived outside Cedar Grove. That success had never once cured the loneliness she carried, that she could walk into any room in the country and command it completely, and still go home every night to an apartment that felt like a hotel room she'd just never checked out of. Neither of them tried to fix the other's pain. They just listened, the way people do when they've finally found someone who isn't waiting for their turn to speak. His daughter noticed the shift too, in her own way. She'd started asking about Lucy more at home, whether she liked board games, whether she had a favorite color, whether she'd ever come over for dinner sometime instead of just breakfast at the diner. Small questions, but they added up to something Douglas hadn't let himself think too hard about yet. One afternoon, walking Lucy to her car after she'd stayed later than usual, she turned to him with a question that caught him off guard. "Would your daughter ever be upset?" Lucy asked carefully, "if someone secretly helped make her future a little easier?" Douglas laughed, not quite understanding where the question was headed. She'd probably never even notice. "Why do you ask?" Lucy just smiled, the real kind, the one she used to hold back before all of this started. "No reason," she said. "Just something I've been thinking about." She didn't explain further. And Douglas, standing there in the parking lot with the evening light fading behind her, had no idea yet just how much that quiet smile was about to change for both of them. With small things Douglas almost didn't notice. A note came home from school one Friday, saying his daughter's field trip fee had already been covered. He assumed it was a mix-up, called the office to sort it out, and was told the balance simply showed as paid in full, no explanation attached. Then, a few weeks later, a box of books arrived at the apartment. Not from any store he recognized, no return address, just a note tucked inside that read, "For a girl who deserves every story she wants to read." Douglas turned the box over twice, checked with the building super in case it had been delivered to the wrong unit, and came up with nothing. His daughter, delighted, didn't ask questions. She just stacked the books on her shelf and started reading one that night before bed. The third time it happened, Douglas couldn't ignore it anymore. Her music teacher pulled him aside after a lesson and mentioned, almost in passing, that the sponsorship covering her violin lessons for the rest of the year had come through. Douglas blinked at her. "Sponsorship? I didn't apply for anything." The teacher looked equally confused. "It came through the school's foundation partnerships. I assumed you knew." Douglas didn't know, but he had a growing suspicion. That evening, he sat his daughter down gently and asked if she'd said anything to anyone about wanting new books, or worrying about her lessons, or anything at all that a stranger might have overheard. "I told Miss Lucy I was scared I'd have to stop violin because it costs money," she admitted, looking down at her hands. Was that wrong? Douglas felt something in his chest tighten, half frustration, half something softer he couldn't quite name. No, baby, that wasn't wrong. The next morning, he confronted Lucy the second she sat down in booth 7, sliding into the seat across from her before she'd even taken her coat off. The books, the violin, the field trip. He kept his voice low, aware of the other tables nearby. "That's you, isn't it?" Lucy didn't deny it. She simply folded her hands and looked at him steadily. "You would have refused if I'd asked you directly." "Of course I would have. That's exactly why I didn't ask." Douglas exhaled hard, running a hand over his face. "Lucy, I can't just let you—" "You're not letting me do anything," she said, gently but firmly. "This isn't charity, Douglas. I'm not trying to make you feel like you can't provide for your own daughter. I know you can. I've watched you do it every single day for almost a year." She paused, her voice softening further. "This is me investing in someone before they even know what they're capable of becoming. Somebody did that for me once. Now it's my turn to do it for someone else." Douglas sat back, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, though not all of it. You could have told me first. Would you have said yes? He thought about it honestly. Probably not. Then I made the right call. There was a long pause between them, the diner noise filling the space where words weren't. Finally, Douglas said, quieter now, "It's not the money, you know. It's not even close to being about the money." "I know," Lucy said. "It's that you noticed. That she said something small, something she probably wasn't even trying to make a big deal out of, and you actually did something about it." Lucy's eyes glistened, though she blinked it back quickly. "Someone believed in me before I ever believed in myself, Douglas. I spent years wishing I could thank him properly, and never got the chance. This is the closest I've ever come to paying that forward the way he meant for me to." Douglas reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had the morning she told him everything. "You didn't help us because you had billions sitting in some account," he said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke it. "You helped us because you remember exactly what it felt like to have nothing. That's not the same thing at all." Lucy's composure finally broke, just slightly, tears slipping free before she could stop them. She didn't wipe them away this time. She just let them fall, sitting there in booth 7 with her hand in his, the diner humming quietly around them like it understood enough to give them the moment. "Nobody's ever put it that way before," she said. "Maybe nobody's paid close enough attention," Douglas said. They sat like that for a while, neither one in any hurry to let go, and Douglas felt something shift inside his chest that he'd been trying to talk himself out of for weeks now. It wasn't gratitude anymore. It wasn't even just friendship, not really. Not the way it had started almost a year ago, over coffee and a folded $10 bill. It had become something bigger than either of them had planned for, sitting quietly in a diner booth on an ordinary Tuesday morning, wrapped up in books his daughter hadn't asked for, and violin lessons paid for by a woman who understood better than anyone what it meant to be given a chance nobody expected. Later that night, after his daughter had gone to bed hugging one of the new books to her chest, Douglas sat at his kitchen table and thought about everything Lucy had told him: the roadside diner, the folded bill, the promise she'd carried quietly for years without anyone to share it with. He understood now that the gifts weren't really about money, same as her $10 had never really been about money either. They were about a woman who'd learned, the hard way, that sometimes the smallest gesture could hand someone their whole future back. And somewhere in the quiet of that thought, Douglas realized his feelings for her had stopped being simple a long time ago, and he wasn't entirely sure anymore that he wanted them to go back to being simple at all. The months that followed moved differently than any Douglas had known before. Breakfast at Cedar Grove had become tradition in a way that no longer needed explaining to anyone who worked there. Denny stopped teasing him about watching the door. The other waiters stopped asking why booth 7 got cleared first, why the coffee was always ready a beat before Lucy walked in. It had simply become part of how the diner breathed each morning, same as the smell of bacon grease and the chime of the bell. Even when Lucy traveled, the routine held. She called the diner most mornings she was away, not to check on business or ask about reservations, just to ask Douglas how his daughter's week was going, whether the violin lessons were paying off, whether he'd slept enough the past few nights. Denny took to leaving a note by the register on the mornings she called, just her name and the time, like she was still somehow present, even 3 time zones away. "You didn't have to call today," Douglas told her once, phone pressed to his shoulder while he restocked the coffee station. "I wanted to," Lucy said, her voice a little tired but warm underneath it. "Some habits are worth keeping, even from a hotel room in Chicago." Douglas smiled at that more than he probably should have, standing there in an empty diner at 6:45 in the morning, phone against his ear like a teenager, instead of a 34-year-old father who thought he'd made peace with never feeling this way again. Around the same time, he finally signed the paperwork on the corner lot 2 blocks from his apartment, the one he'd walked past for 3 years, imagining a name over the door that had never quite settled into anything real until now. The building had sat empty so long that pigeons had claimed the awning, but Douglas saw past all of that the first time he stood inside it with the keys in his hand. Lucy found out almost by accident when Douglas mentioned in passing that he'd need to start looking into contractors and financing before he lost his nerve. A week later, an investment came through from a small business fund he'd never heard of, structured in a way that left him fully in control. No strings, no board seats, no conditions, beyond simply following through on the dream he'd been talking about for a year. He confronted her, same as he had with the books and the violin lessons. "It's structured so you own everything," Lucy said, before he could even get the accusation fully out. "I made sure of that. I didn't want it to be my project wearing your name. I wanted it to be yours." "Lucy, I'm not trying to buy anything, Douglas. I promise you that." Her voice had none of the businesslike calm she used everywhere else in her life. It was softer, almost nervous, in a way he'd never heard from her before. "I just believe in what you're building, and I happen to be in a position to help it happen a little sooner than it would have otherwise." Douglas sat with that for a long moment, watching her across booth 7, coffee going lukewarm between them. "You realize you keep doing this, showing up in ways that change everything, and then acting like it's nothing. Is it working?" Despite himself, Douglas laughed. "Yeah, it's working." His daughter's role in all of it kept deepening too, quiet and unplanned, the way most real things seem to grow. She'd started calling Lucy Miss Lucy without anyone suggesting it, folding her into weekend plans like she'd always been part of them. Grocery trips, homework help at the kitchen table, an afternoon spent teaching Lucy how to braid hair badly enough that they both ended up laughing, until Douglas came home to find ribbon scattered across the living room floor. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, his daughter looked up from her cereal and asked, without any hesitation at all, "Can you come to my school play, Miss Lucy?" Lucy went quiet for a moment, long enough that Douglas glanced over, worried he'd need to smooth over an awkward silence. But when Lucy answered, her voice had a catch in it he'd never heard before. "I would love that," she said. "Nobody's asked me something that simple in a very long time." She came to the play, sat in a folding chair in a school gymnasium instead of a boardroom, clapped louder than anyone else in the audience when his daughter forgot half her line, and improvised her way through it anyway. Watching the two of them afterward, laughing together over punch and cookies at a folding table meant for third graders, Douglas felt something settle in his chest that he'd been circling around for months without letting himself name it directly. He loved her. Not the idea of her, not the gratitude for everything she'd quietly given his family, but her, exactly as she was, folded $10 bills and boardroom composure and all. Their relationship deepened after that, in ways that never needed grand gestures. Evening walks after his daughter went to bed, sitting together on the fire escape drinking coffee that had gone cold hours before. Sunsets they watched from the unfinished dining room of his new restaurant, surrounded by drywall dust and half-installed light fixtures. Cooking dinner together some nights, badly. Laughing at how neither of them could manage a decent roux despite Lucy owning companies worth billions, and Douglas working a kitchen counter for a living. No dramatic confessions. Just two people slowly learning how to heal in each other's company, one ordinary evening at a time. One night, without telling Douglas where she was going, Lucy drove 3 hours to the town where it had all started. The roadside diner from her story, or what was left of it. The building had been abandoned for years, the sign faded past reading, weeds pushing up through the cracked parking lot, where she'd once sat crying in a car with a broken windshield and nowhere left to go. She stood there a long time in the quiet dark, the same way she must have stood there at 19, except now she wasn't running from anything. She placed one final $10 bill on the old windowsill, folded once down the middle, exactly the way it had been folded into her palm all those years ago. "Thank you," she whispered, to a man she'd never see again, to a version of herself she'd spent years trying to make proud. She smiled out into the darkness, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight for longer than she could remember. For the first time in years, Lucy Adair wasn't looking backward anymore. She was ready, finally, to look forward, toward a diner 2 hours away, a man who'd never once asked her for anything but honesty, and a little girl who'd taught her that sometimes the simplest question in the world could mean everything. We're one morning away from the ending, and if this story has made you believe in second chances even a little, Don't walk away from it now. Subscribe before you go, because the people who need reminding that love and kindness still exist deserve to see how this ends too. Autumn had settled over the city by the time Douglas noticed the leaves outside Cedar Grove had turned the color of the coffee Lucy drank every morning, deep amber, gold at the edges. It struck him, standing at the window before the diner opened, that it had been almost a year to the day since he first watched her fold a $10 bill and slide it beneath her plate without a word. He hadn't planned on remembering the exact date. It had simply stayed with him, the way certain mornings do, marking themselves without permission. The diner felt different that day, though nothing about it had visibly changed. Same booths, same chipped mugs, same smell of bacon grease that never quite left the air. But Douglas moved through his opening routine slower than usual, glancing toward the door more than he needed to, the way he used to before he understood why. Lucy arrived at 7 o'clock, exactly as she always had. Cream coat this time, the autumn chill finally cool enough to need it. She walked the same path she always walked, past the counter, past the register, straight to booth 7, and for a moment Douglas felt the strange comfort of watching something ordinary repeat itself one more time before whatever came next. He brought her coffee. She thanked him the way she always did. And for a few minutes, they sat in the kind of silence that had stopped needing to be filled a long time ago. Then Lucy reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a bill, folded once down the middle, exactly the way she'd folded it every morning since the first day he'd met her. She set it on the table. Douglas looked at it, then at her, and felt something settle into place that he'd been circling around without quite naming for months. "You're not going to ask why, are you?" Lucy said, watching his face. "I don't need to anymore," Douglas said. "I already know." Something shifted in her expression at that, not surprise exactly, more like relief, like she'd been waiting a long time for someone to reach that understanding, without her having to spell it out. She reached across the table then and slid the bill aside, slow and deliberate, the way she did most things that mattered to her. Underneath it sat a small velvet box. Douglas felt the air leave the room, or maybe it was just his own breath catching somewhere behind his ribs. He looked up at her, unable to find a single word worth saying yet. "Someone once gave me $10 so my future could start over," Lucy said, her voice steady despite the tears already gathering at the edges of her eyes. "I spent years thinking that was the whole story, that the $10 was the ending, the moment everything turned around for me." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I understand now. It was never the ending. It was just the beginning of a much longer road, and I didn't know where that road was actually leading until I walked into this diner and met you." Douglas reached for her hand across the table, his own hand not quite steady either. "You taught me that the future isn't something you build by yourself," Lucy continued. "I spent so long believing I had to carry everything alone, that success meant doing it without needing anyone. And then I watched you carry your whole world on your shoulders every single morning, and somehow you still had room in your hands for other people. For Mr. Ellery, for a stranger sleeping outside in the cold, for a woman who walked in here needing far more than she ever let herself admit." She opened the box. The ring inside caught the morning light coming through the diner windows, simple and unshowy, nothing like the life she lived outside these walls. "Douglas Lewis," she said, her voice breaking now, no longer trying to hold it together. "Will you let me spend every tomorrow I have left with you?" For a moment, Douglas couldn't speak at all. He looked at her, at the ring, at the folded bill sitting off to the side of the table, like it had quietly done its job and could finally rest. Behind him, he heard the kitchen doors swing open. His daughter walked out first, in her school clothes, grinning so wide it looked like it might hurt. Behind her came Denny, wiping his hands on his apron, and two of the other waiters who were supposed to be clocked in for the morning shift, instead of standing there watching everything unfold. Even Mr. Ellery had made his way over from his usual booth, leaning on his cane, smiling the way a man smiles when he's watched something good finally arrive. "You all knew," Douglas said, looking around at every one of them. "Somebody had to help her get the ring box past the kitchen without you seeing," Denny said, grinning. "Wasn't easy hiding it in the walk-in cooler for 2 days, I'll tell you that much." Douglas laughed, despite the tears already slipping down his own face, and when he turned back to Lucy, there was no hesitation left in him at all. "Yes," he said, "but only if every morning still starts with coffee." The diner erupted. Laughter, applause, his daughter running around the booth to hug them both at once. Denny banging a spoon against a mug, like it was a wedding bell. Lucy slipped the ring onto his finger, and Douglas folded the $10 bill and tucked it into his wallet, not to spend, but to keep. Later, once his restaurant finally opened its doors 2 blocks from where they now stood, a small framed note hung on the wall near the entrance. Easy to miss, unless you knew to look for it. It read simply, "Never underestimate what $10, one kind stranger, and one ordinary morning can do." Every year, on the anniversary of the morning they met, Douglas and Lucy left a folded $10 bill beneath a coffee cup for someone who needed it more than they did. They never waited around to see who found it, and they never needed to be thanked. One evening, cleaning up after a long day at the restaurant, his daughter looked up from wiping down a table and asked, "Dad, do you think whoever helped Miss Lucy ever found out what happened because of him?" Douglas glanced toward Lucy, who was laughing with a customer near the counter, completely unaware she was being watched. "Maybe he never found out," Douglas said softly, "but I think that's the part that matters most. Real kindness doesn't need applause. It just needs somebody willing to pass it on. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.